Hello and welcome to this lecture video. And so in this lecture video, I'm going to be talking about some conceptual points regarding cost allocation. If you're following along, I'm on page 257 of your course pack, okay? So looking at some additional points on allocating costs, one thing is that management wants to make sure that they allocate costs based on budgeted costs rather than actual costs. And so if I go back to this problem that we talked about earlier, the liars, cheaters, and fools, you can see that we're using budgeted costs and budgeted costs. And some of the other problems that we looked at in the course pack, they're all based upon budgeted costs, not the actual costs, okay? If we allowed the allocation of actual amounts, that would allow for the division's inefficiencies to be passed on to other departments. And so let me come back to that liars, cheaters, and fools problem. So again, look what goes into the numerator when we're calculating this out is $150,000 budgeted variable costs, and that was on page 251 of your course pack. And so if we used actual costs over here, first of all, this could change all the time. And or if we use actual costs even over here, this would change. And so first of all, it makes it really hard for the criminal law division to budget because they don't know how much cost they're going to get. If we can do it based on budgeted, it makes it easier for the person or the division receiving the cost to do their budgeting because they know exactly how much they'll get. In this case, they know they're going to get 60% of the fixed costs. In this case, they know they're going to get 37.5 cost allocate 37.5 cents allocated to them per computer minute time. So it makes it easier for criminal law to do budgeting. The other thing that I was talking about is it allows those cost inefficiencies to be passed on to other production departments. And so what I mean by that, if we look over here, if we, rather than budgeted, if we use the actual costs, we would allow any cost overruns. And what I mean by that is any excess of actual costs, the costs that they actually incurred over the budget. They could pass that on, the computer system division manager could pass that on to the criminal law manager. And that's not really fair. So in this case, what happens is the computer system manager has a budget. You can see it's $850,000. If they actually have actual costs of $900,000, then they're going to have a negative budget variance at the end of the year. And we're going to hold them accountable for that to say, why did you go over budget? Because we don't want you to go over budget, okay? But if we let them allocate their costs based upon their actual, not the 850, but maybe the 900, we would allow them to pass those inefficiencies on to other divisions. And that's what we're saying we don't want to do, okay? So that's what we're saying right over here. We won't let you pass those on to other departments. The other thing that I want to talk about is two-stage cost allocation. So service departments, remember the support functions, they allocate their costs out to operating departments, and that's the direct method. So remember, with the direct method, we're talking service departments allocate their costs to production departments. Service departments don't allocate their costs to other service departments. Those costs that were allocated from a service department into the operating department costs then are assigned down to the unit level, like what we talked about back in job order costing. So an example would be, assume we have our total janitorial costs of $10,000. Assume that janitorial allocates its costs to machining and to assembly on the basis of 60 and 40. So that would be $6,000 to machining and then $4,000 to assembly. Then we also have a maintenance department. Remember, janitorial and maintenance are both service departments, okay? Maintenance department has $15,000. 1/3 goes to machining, 2/3 goes to assembly. And then in accounting, that's also the third service department. Their expenses are $8,000, and they go 50% to machining, 50% to assembly. And the other thing is that janitorial, maintenance, and accounting are considered product costs. They're service departments, but they are considered product costs, which means that they can show up in cost of goods sold. They're not period costs. They're product costs, so they'll eventually show up in cost of goods sold. So what we're going to do relating this to these two stages is we're going to push these service department costs to machining and assembly, and then machining and assembly those are considered overhead, and then that overhead will be pushed down to the unit level, just like what we talked about in job order costing and also with process costing. Okay? So when we look at stage one in a little bit more detail, assign the costs from service departments to operating departments. So it gives a total of $15,000 to machining, which is that $6,000, and then that $5,000, and then the $4,000. And I got that from the $6,000, and then also our $4,000 right over here, and then 1/3 the $5,000. Okay. And then we also have $18,000 going to assembly, the $4,000, and then the 2/3 gives us the 10, and then half of the accounting to assembly. And then what we do is we add in our direct costs of $10,000 for machining, and then $18,000 for assembly. These are direct costs, which means that we can directly attribute them to machining and then to assembly. And then what we have is the total, so that gives us the total of $25,000, right? The 15 plus the 10, and then the 18 plus the 18, $36,000 for assembly. So that's stage one, which we assign those service department costs to our operating departments, okay? Then in stage two, what we do is we calculate our predetermined overhead rate, and then we allocate those costs to our jobs, just like what we did in job order costing. So let's assume that the allocation base for machining is machine hours and labor for assembly. Let's also assume that our total machine hours for machining is 10,000. Assume that total allocation base or direct labor hours for assembly is 20,000. When we think back to job order costing, the first thing that we do is we calculate our predetermined overhead rate. How do we do that? We take estimated overhead divided by estimated allocation base. Estimated overhead for machining divided by my estimated allocation base for machining. That gives me $2.50 per machine hour. I repeat the same process over here for assembly, where I take my $36,000, which is my total overhead, divided by my 20,000 direct labor hours for assembly, $1.80 per direct labor hour. So this is our overhead rate. Let's assume that job 236 uses 2,000 machine hours and 4,000 direct labor hours. Let's figure out how much overhead it will receive. Well, we can take our rate, $2.50, times the amount of allocation base used, the rate times the amount of allocation base used, and then that helps us to figure out what our total is for our job in terms of overhead. That's the way we would do that. 12,200 overhead assigned. The way we got that, 2.5 times the 4,000 plus 1.8 times the 4,000 gives us that total overhead. So stage two is just like what we did back in job order costing, and then we add in stage one, which is new for this chapter, which is where we take those service department costs and then we push them to the operating departments, okay? So continuing on to the next page, let's talk about some problems with cost allocation, okay? So the first one would be some allocation of costs that would be not controllable, which would not be fair. We've talked about that before, that managers should only be held accountable for the costs that are in their control. If it's outside their control, it's not fair to hold them accountable for that, okay? How can we make sure that the manager is only accountable for those costs that are within their control? We can have a responsibility accounting system. We have a responsibility center, and then we track costs and revenues by that responsibility center. And I'll talk about that more here in a few minutes. We also have another problem where we could have some arbitrary allocations. If we think back to that Taylor-Bath problem that we talked about in the other lecture video where we were talking about the direct method, and we were saying we could either use square footage or direct labor hours to allocate out the cost, the maintenance cost. And what we were saying is that we had two different allocation bases. Maybe you could make a justification for square footage, Maybe you could make another justification for direct labor hours. It could be equally justifiable. And so which one you choose becomes somewhat arbitrary, but it does influence which department gets more cost than the other. Okay? The other problem that we have is the idea of unitized fixed cost. And so what this is saying is that when fixed costs are put on a unit basis, they're said to be unitized. So for example, if I think back over here to this liars, cheaters, and fools problem, which was on page 251 of your course pack. Remember what we did here is we allocated out our fixed costs differently than we allocated out our variable costs. We allocated out our fixed costs based upon these fixed percentages. Let's say that we didn't do that. Let's just put this aside for a second and say we put all overhead, all costs of the computer system, $850,000, in one big bucket, and we allocated it out using computer time. Okay, so in that case, what we have when we do the math, $2.125 per minute, which is higher than the 37.5 cents that we were charging, right? When the division manager of criminal law receives this charge, right? We'll just say it's $2 a minute, okay? Rounded to $2 a minute. What happens is that they think it looks like a variable cost to that manager. Because the more computer minutes that they use, the more expenses that they receive. And I'll say that again. It appears variable to them because the more computer minutes that they use, the more expenses that they receive. So in that case, the problem is that they may not want to take on a project that may result in more computer minutes. Even though that project could be useful for the entire company, it may not be useful for their division because they're going to take on more computer minutes. But the problem is, right, this $700,000 is a fixed cost. If they take on the project or they don't take on the project, it doesn't change this number right here at the organizational level. So you have a cost perception mismatch. This is a fixed cost at the organizational level. It is a fixed cost. But if I put it on a unit basis, in this case a computer minute unit, it appears variable to the person receiving the cost, and then as a result, they may not want to take on certain projects that could be profitable for the entire company, because if they take on this project for the entire company, this $700,000 in total won't change. It just changes their share. So they may not want to take it on because it's not profitable for their division, but it could be profitable for the entire company. So there's a perception mismatch, and that's what I mean by this idea of unitized fixed cost. It appears variable to that division manager, it's fixed at the company level, and as a result, they may not undertake a project. So how do we get around this problem? We use lump sum allocations. That's what we did in that liars, tutors, and fools problem. Okay, we did a fixed percentage. Another problem with cost allocation is that we can have too few cost pools. We can put too much cost in one cost pool and then allocate it out. Maybe we put all fixed and variable expenses of the computer system in one cost pool, and then that distorts things. Okay. The other problem that we can have is only using volume-related allocation basis. Not all costs vary with volume. And so we do have some examples of costs that don't vary or don't increase or decrease with volume. And one of them would be setting up equipment. Okay, setting up equipment. So if I have to set up some equipment to make a new laptop, I may have to set up that equipment whether I make one laptop or 50 laptops. So it doesn't vary with production volume. And if you only use direct labor or direct labor costs or machine hours, those are considered volume-related allocation basis, which means that they increase with the more that you make. In that case, if you use only volume-related allocation basis, it could distort the cost allocations because not all costs vary with volume, such as setup. This last one, the direct method of allocating costs, It allocates service departments to production departments. So the right answer